Morning. Annyeonghaseyo. Konbanwa. Bonjour. Guten Tag. Buenos dias. Welcome to today's live stream. Amazing things happen sometimes, quite irrationally. And so I want to tell you about my experience. For the longest time, I've been struggling with how to explain my dissatisfaction with Dr. Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules of Life. And that's not an easy thing to do because Jordan Peterson is so popular around the world. And so this amazing BTS Army event, the launch of Map of the Soul Persona by BTS and the BTS Army, has caused me to go back to look at some things in Dr. Jung's work. And when I did, I realized, thanks to going back and looking at things that I read decades ago, and thanks to questions that I've had from the BTS Army in the last week, I suddenly realized what the answer is. And so I'm going to share it with you. And I want to thank the members, thank the members of the BTS Army for giving me this insight and also this opportunity to tell this story, because as many of you probably know, Dr. Jordan Peterson has been a phenomenon around the world, and there have been many young people, young men especially, who've said that they are nihilistic, and Dr. Jordan Peterson has offered a handrail to those young men. I think it's partially a function of fact that, let me get this set up right so I can see what I'm doing here. It's partially the function of the fact that we have such a high divorce rate around the world these days that young men especially have not been well fathered. And so Dr. Peterson has become a father figure for many young men around the world and given them a new direction in life. And that is great, okay? And so I don't want to say anything about that. But in the course of this week, as I've looked at the BTS phenomenon, I suddenly realized that there is something beyond the rules of life that we all need to understand. Good morning, Sean. Nice to see you today. My subscriber, Sean, did a very nice video that includes my voice, and I really appreciate that, Sean. And Sean, please put a link to your video up on the chat, and I'll approve it when I see it so that others can see what we're talking about. But in any case, Dr. Peterson gave the 12 Rules of Life, and I didn't like it very much. And one of the reasons was that when Dr. Peterson dictated or read his 12 Rules of Life for Audible.com, he did it like an irritated father. And I really felt irritated by the way the presentation was given, and I would urge Dr. Peterson to redo that Audible.com in a less strident tone. And I remember a couple of years back in American politics when Representative Scalise commented because Steve Bannon had come over to Congress and especially the GOP caucus and scolded them about going along with our president's point of view. And Representative Scalise, after that talk, made the comment, I haven't been talked at like that since I was 18 years old, and my father did it, and I didn't listen to him either. And so all of us don't listen to our parents very often when they scold us, and that's understandable. That's a natural reaction in life. But anyway, I couldn't really put my finger on what was wrong and what is wrong in the perspective of Dr. Peterson issuing the 12 Rules of Life. And finally, thanks to the BTS Army and pushing me along on these live streams, I finally grokked it. And it has to do with Dr. Jung's definitions of rational and irrational. And so I'm going to read those two definitions to you. But before that, I'm going to read the 12 Rules of Life. I'm going to read Dr. Jung's version of the Rules of Life. And as you will hear, Dr. Jung was quite the opposite of Dr. Peterson. And even though Jordan Peterson does often speaks of Carl Jung in his lectures, and Gray correctly says here, life has no rules. That is its mystery, absolutely. And so I'm going to read those rules. I'm just waiting for a few more viewers to join us because people are joining from around the world before I read these rules of life. But even though Dr. Peterson often does speak of Carl Jung's work and his perspectives, he actually came down on the opposite side from what Dr. Jung said. And so that's what I want to address today. So Aeneas says, to be honest, Peterson gives birth to men who honestly believe social justice warriors and snowflakes, who are mostly just human rights activists, are the problem of society. Unfortunately, that's true. And let me explain to you why that happens. Men tend to want rules, and so when they get rules, they gobble them up because they say, oh boy, if I only follow these rules, I'm going to understand how to do life. And young men who haven't been fathered haven't gotten enough rules, so they really don't know or think they know how to do life. And I had this experience in the Marine Corps. The Marine Corps is about rules, entirely about rules, and nobody diverges from those rules. And I remember junior officers and other Marines saying to me, just tell me what to do and I'll do it. And boy, you can count on the Marine Corps for that. If the President of the United States gives the Marine Corps a mission, they are going to do it, and they're going to do it to the best of their ability and very powerfully. But what they would say is, just tell me what to do, but don't bother me about the politics. I don't want to know about the politics. And the problem is, everything in life is politics, and you have to be able to deal with politics in order to deal with life. That's essential. And so in the Marine Corps, 95% of all the generals in the Marine Corps are STJ. And they're the type of people that say, just give me a mission and I will execute that mission. Or it's a naval officers up to 2 stars who say, just tell me who to kill and I'll go do it. But the problem is, those are not the guys that get to the top ranks, the 3 and 4 star ranks. And the reason they don't is because they don't know the politics. They follow the rules very well, and if you follow the rules very well, you're going to rise to a certain level. But there's a level beyond that where you're not following, you can't follow the rules precisely anymore, and that's politics. And so in American history, we have Colin Powell, for example, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff during Gulf War I, and you see that he's not an STJ, he is an NTJ. And so that means he was always able to play the politics, and that got him promoted to a 4-star general, and it ultimately made him Secretary of State. And that was because he was beyond the rules. So now, since we have enough people that have joined us, I'm going to read Dr. Jung's The Rules of Life. And there's a little story here, because this little essay, it's only 1 page, I printed it out so I could read it to you easily, is on page 625 of volume 18 of the Collected Works of C.G. Jung. And the significance of that to me is that even the editors of the Collected Works of C.G. Jung thought that this is a little bit dangerous doctrine. So what I'm going to teach you now is about a leap in consciousness, and it is a bit dangerous, but I think that we've now turned a corner, and BTS is a super example of how humanity can and must turn a corner in our consciousness. And so I'm going to share this with you, and then we'll go on. And Chris Peck says, have you read Peterson, Skip? And the answer to that is yes, I've read Maps of Meaning and 12 Rules of Life. And for example, here's a paradox, right? In the last 2 sentences of Maps of Meaning, he says, don't lie. And one of the 12 rules of life is don't lie. But the problem is life doesn't work that way. Okay, when I was about 28, and so I wasn't too much of a spring chicken, one time my wife at the time spent 3 hours in the beauty shop having this nice poofy hairdo done in the beauty shop. And when she came home, I didn't notice it. And I said, and then she asked me, didn't you notice my hair? And I said, oh yeah, it's nice. But she knew I was lying, okay? And she knew that I just didn't know what to say. And so here's one rule for all young men. If your wife comes home from the beauty store and she has spent 3 hours in the chair with a beautician, be sure to tell her you love her hair, and whether you like it or not. And that's a what we call a little white lie, that if you don't tell, you're going to have a very miserable day and maybe a miserable week or month. And so you can't have rigid rules, and we're going to get into that in more detail. Okay, so thank you for the various comments I'm getting from my regular subscribers like Gray and Sean, but I'm going to go on for the benefit of the BTS Army now and read these pieces out of Dr. Jung's work, and then I will come back to your chat comments later. You're free to talk all you want. So Chris says, so then you're offering rules. Actually, I'm not offering rules, although that was a practical rule that I just offered. And so you'll see how that works in just a few minutes. And anytime you have a rule, immediately there's an opposite to the rule, which Chris is proving to us on the chat right now. And so let's take it from the horse's mouth. and lets you consider these things, and then we'll come back to the rest of the comments. I'm sure if there are Jungian analysts on this live stream, you may get some interesting chats from them too. But that is what's irrational but yet true. Okay, so this is Dr. Jung's short essay called The Rules of Life, and it was found in a magazine entitled World Watch. That was the English name. It's Weltwatch in Swiss, I guess, or German. And it was published on December the 10th, 1954. And as I said, it's pretty much been hidden from the Jungian community because it's in volume 18 of the Collected Works, so you have to be really dedicated to get back to volume 18. And what it says in the footnote here is that Jung was one of several prominent persons asked to comment on this subject. So, Dr. Carl Jung speaking now, The Rules of Life. In reply to your kind inquiry about rules of life, I would like to remark that I have had so much to do with people that I have always endeavored to live by no rules as far as possible. Non-observance of rules requires, of course, far less effort, for usually one makes a rule in order to repress the tendency in oneself not to follow it. In psychology, above all, rules are valid only when they can be reversed. Also, they are not without dangers, since they consist of words, and our civilization is largely founded on a superstitious belief in words. One of the supreme religious assumptions is actually the word. Words can take the place of men and things. This has its advantages, but it also is a menace. One can then spare oneself the trouble of thinking for oneself or making any effort, to one's own advantage or disadvantage, and that of one's fellows. I have, for instance, a tendency to make a principle of doing what I want to do or should do as soon as possible. This can be very unwise and even stupid. The same applies to practically all adages and rules of life. Take, for example, the saying, "Whatever it be, act prudently and consider the ends." But in this way, however praiseworthy the principle is, you can let a vitally important decision of the moment slip through your fingers. No rules can cope with the paradoxes of life. Moral law, like natural law, represents only one aspect of reality. It does not prevent one from following certain regular habits unconsciously. Habits which one does not notice oneself, but can only discover by making careful inquiries among one's fellows. But people seldom enjoy having what they don't know about themselves pointed out to them by others, and so they prefer to lay down rules which are the exact opposite of what they are doing in reality. And so they prefer to lay down rules which are the exact opposite of what they are doing in reality. Okay, that was Dr. Jung's cut on the rules of life. And as you can see, his cut is quite contrary to Jordan Peterson's cut. And Chris Peck said, "Julia, everyone is flawed, but that's not an argument against anything he said." Okay, thank you, Chris. I'll come back to those comments after a bit. Okay, so what's the issue here? Jordan Peterson focuses on the logos and how the logos has built up society. And he's created the standard duality, rational logos versus irrational eros. But there's a huge, huge problem in that. And that problem is that creates a new duality. Okay, as soon as you have a rule, my wife has pointed this out to me this morning. She's a Buddhist teacher, and by that I mean she did a 3-year retreat, which is sort of the Buddhist equivalent of divinity school, but she never became ordained. Thank goodness for me. So we're married, and she's not a nun. But she observed that anytime you have a rule, it immediately creates a duality, and then you have the start of a neurosis. Okay, it's either crashing together or pulling apart, and so the distinction, which I discovered or really intuited this morning, was I went back and I read the definitions of rational and irrational in Dr. Jung's book, Psychological Types by C.G. Jung. This is volume 6 of the Collected Works of C.G. Jung. And he has over 100 pages of definitions in the back, and these definitions are quite long. But let me give you a sense of what I'm driving at here. What he's talking about is not a duality between rational and irrational. What he's talking about is rational as a circle, as a mandala, and irrational as a bigger circle. So as human consciousness gets broader, it means that we still have irrational factors out in the world. But many of those irrational factors are valuable because that's how we progress. We have the rational, and we take from the irrational things that we need to expand our level of knowledge. And so think of it as a circle within a circle. Unfortunately, I planned to do graphics, but I ran out of time in my preparation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first read Dr. Jung's definition of rational, and then I'm going to come back and read his definition of irrational. And what you will see is that rational and irrational are not a duality in the Jung world. Rational is a mandala, which we look around our world today, and it's all based on rationality. Okay, we have to have 100% rationality when we make a cell phone, 100% rationality when we build an automobile or an airplane. It can't be even 1,000th% different from a perfect iPhone or a perfect automobile, or as Boeing is learning, a perfect airplane. The airplane has to be perfect. If it's not perfect, then it's not an airplane, as people on Ethiopian Airlines and Indonesian Airlines learned to their death. And so when we need rationality in civilization, whatever it is to do our job, whatever it is, it has to be 100%. But in order to advance, in order to get the next generation of iPhone, we have to look to the irrational. And that's what BTS represents, because they were born into a rather conservative Asian society. The Korean society is by and large pretty conservative. And it's conservative because it's very rational. But then K-pop emerged from Korean society, and that was irrational, but it was brought into the rationality of Korean culture. And so Dr. Jung indicated that when you have something coming into your culture and you have room for it, that's an indication of a very healthy society, a society that can accept irrational factors coming in and then make it a part of the culture, that's a very healthy thing. But societies that can't stand that, and that's traditional authoritarianism, for example, they can't stand any break from rationality. It's my way or the highway. And the result is that those societies are very brittle, and in the end, they can't survive. And if you go back and take a look at the movie Gandhi as an example, there's a scene in Gandhi where Gandhi is doing the irrational thing against the British government. He's fasting, and because he's fasting, he's gotten hundreds of millions of Indians to pay attention to what he's saying, to his message. And his close supporters are very worried about whether he's going to die. And a woman comes in and talks about that and urges him to take some food. And he said, the thing that gives me hope is that throughout history, there have been tyrants, and there have been many tyrants. But in the end, they always fail. Think of it, always. And the reason is that they're trying to stay so concrete that they don't give their culture an opportunity to expand. And so it's to the huge credit of the South Korean culture that it has room for K-pop first, and then for BTS itself. And now we're about to see what societies around the world are really going to accept BTS, because although I know that BTS has many albums and they've been working on this for a long time, their current album, Map of the Soul Persona, which is going to drop next Friday, is going to burst the whole thing wide open. And so I've been working on a problem for years, which is how to educate young people about psychology. And I've been doing it in a very rational way. I created a website. I posted 3,500 essays on that website, and nothing was happening. And then 3 years ago, I started to do this YouTube channel because I saw that there was interest in YouTube among young people, and still not much was happening because I have been doing it in a very rational way, like a professor, like Jordan Peterson, trying to educate people into Jungian psychology. And if you look at this channel, you'll now find 900 videos before this one trying to teach Jungian psychology. But I have been approaching it in a very rational way. And the reason nobody else has done it is that people who are Jungian analysts do not want people around the world to grok Jungian psychology, because they created a profession of Jungian analysis. And so they don't want you to understand the significance of what Dr. Jung said about religion, about art, and about psychology itself, for that matter. And so they'll bring you to water, and you can go to a Jung Society meeting somewhere, and they'll tell you about a nice myth, and you'll say, oh, wow, golly gee, that's interesting. And what happens is one or two people that go to that meeting have been thinking about having analysis, so they go up to the Jungian analyst, and that becomes their intake for that profession. But they're not really telling you what it's all about. And so the Jungian community for a century, including Dr. Jung himself, basically hid the religious aspects of Jungian psychology from the general public. And to the extent that it leaked out one way or another, theologians and psychologists repressed it. And so I've always, in terms of educating people about Jungian psychology, I've always been swimming against that stream, which is repression of Jungian psychology. But all of a sudden, the solution appears. So there's my thesis that Jungian psychology is important to the world, the antithesis of all the powers that be in the Jungian world trying to push against expressing that information out into the world. And then the synthesis, magically, is this BTS group and the new album that they're going to put out. Because suddenly, education doesn't matter anymore. Suddenly, or let's call it organized education doesn't matter anymore. Because what Kim Nam-joon, who goes by RM for his stage name, what he and his 6 compatriots are doing are breaking it out of this closed structure that I've been fighting against all this time. So suddenly we're going to have people all over the world talking about Jungian psychology, and it's going to be a breakout moment, and you'll see why the irrational is just as important, if not more important, than the rational. And so now, Chris Peck says, be yourself sounds like a rule. Well, okay. I mean, it's actually not a rule perfectly, because as some of the BTS Army has pointed out, BTS had to exist within Korean culture first, and then also exist within the idea of K-pop generally, and then they could break out and be themselves. So there is a certain amount of logic, a certain amount of culture that's there already that they have to live within in order to, had to live within and have to live within in order to get a start. But now they're breaking out and they are being themselves. So they can be themselves to a point, okay, but not completely. Okay, that's the point. All right, so let me first here now read, let's see, Nia says, no, being yourself is you being born and living. If you want to follow rules, you can, but do it so it reveals yourself to yourself. Good point, Nia. That's a very good point. Okay, so here it is. I'm reading from Psychological Types by C.G. Jung, and I'm reading his definition of rational. And this is in paragraph 785 of this volume, which is volume 6 of the Collected Works of C.G. Jung. Paragraph 785, rational. The rational is the reasonable, that which accords with reason. I conceive reason as an attitude whose principle it is to conform thought, feeling, and action to objective values. Okay, that would be objective values like how do you build an iPhone, for example. Objective values are established by the everyday experience of external facts on the one hand, and of inner psychological facts on the other. So think of this. 30 years ago, there were no iPhones, and Steve Jobs had it all in his mind. Nobody could imagine what he was thinking, but it was in his mind. It was irrational, and it was there, but it wasn't in our rational world. Suddenly it breaks out, and we have iPhones everywhere since, 2003, and now everybody says, now I get it, and now I can rationally do a Me Too, a copy follow on the iPhone, and now we can create more iPhones and more products, iPads, whatever it is, iMac. I'm talking to you through an iMac today. So all these things have been breaking out since then. And so they all got subsumed then under rationality. And so you can't build an iPhone without 100% rationality. But it was just an idea in Steve Jobs' head back in the old days. Okay, so let me begin again, since I've given that example and I don't want to lose you. Okay, so rational. The rational is the reasonable, that which accords with reason. I conceive reason as an attitude whose principle it is to conform thought, feeling, and action to objective values. Objective values are established by the everyday experience of external facts on the one hand, and the inner psychological facts on the other. Such experiences, however, could not represent objective values if they were valued as such by the subject, for that would already amount to an act of reason. The rational attitude which permits us to declare objective values as valid at all is not the work of the individual subject, but the product of human history. So the rational attitude is the product of everything that's come before. And once you think about it as a value, then it's rational. It's only up till that point that it's irrational, even if it's in your own head, as it was in Steve Jobs' head. So Steve had a bunch of irrational things going on in his mind, and suddenly he starts to get this idea. And as soon as he starts to get the idea, then it becomes rational again. But up until then, it was irrational. And so the idea of BTS was just irrationality running around in Kim Nam-joon's head and the other 6 young men's head until, boom, they had the idea, and then they could rationally bring it into the world. Okay, so paragraph 786. Most objective values and reason itself are firmly established complexes of ideas handed down through the ages. Countless generations have labored at their organization with the same necessity with which the living organism reacts to the average, constantly recurring environmental conditions, confronting them with corresponding functional complexes, as the eye, for instance, perfectly corresponds to the nature of light. One might, therefore, speak of a pre-existent metaphysical universal reason, were it not that the adapted reaction of the living organism to average environmental influences is the necessary condition of its existence. A thought already expressed by Schopenhauer. Human reason, accordingly, is nothing other than the expression of man's adaptability to average occurrences, which have gradually become deposited in firmly established complexes of ideas that constitute our objective values. Thus, the laws of reason are the laws that designate and govern the average, correct, adapted attitude. Everything is rational that ascends with these laws. Everything that contravenes them is irrational. Now, Dr. Jung was very much against the average and statistics, and so he gave an example. Excuse me. He gave an example of why he was. He said, dig a big hole 5 feet across and fill it up with rocks. Okay, so 5-inch rocks, let's say. And so you fill it up with 5-inch rocks. Now, is the hole full? And then he says, well, no, it's not, because I can take gravel and I can put it in around the rocks and I can put more things in that hole. And so the average didn't say anything about the gravel, right? And then you can take a bunch of sand, additional sand, and you can fill up the hole with sand, and it takes more things in, okay? And so, and all that is average. Now you have the average, now you can have the average size of the stones and all the matter that's in the hole so far, and you still just have a full hole, okay, just like you did before. Now, is that hole full? Well, actually, it's not, because then you can take water and pour it into the hole, and you can pour a lot of water into that hole. And so, as you see, there are 4 levels of filling the hole, and each one expresses something different. And so, when you reduce things to averages, you end up with rocks. You don't end up with a full hole. And so, all right, let me finish this definition of rational then. So, paragraph 787, thinking and feeling are rational functions insofar as they are decisively influenced by reflection. Okay, you can reflect upon them. They function most perfectly when they are in the fullest possible accord with the laws of reason. The irrational functions, sensation and intuition, are those whose aim is purely perception, for, as far as possible, they are forced to dispense with the rational, which presupposes the exclusion of everything that is outside reason, in order to attain the most complete perception of the general flux of events. So, sensing and intuitive on the MBTI scale are irrational ideas, because if you're a sensing person, okay, you're going to see all these facts, but you haven't thought them out. They're just there. And an intuitive person, the same way, you approach it a little bit differently. So that's what he's talking about there. Now, Nia's competence can easily be manipulated either way. It depends on the status quo. Yes, and it also depends on the situation and the terrain. If you're going to learn the piano, if you have a wonderful Steinway and you have Van Cliburn as your teacher, you're going to get a different result than if you have an old used piano and a teacher who's not quite sure about how to play the piano herself. So, and BTS Army wants me to talk about the two-sided Dionysus, which I will do, but before I do that, let me get back to the irrational here. So, okay. So I've given you the irrational, so now I'm going to give you the irrational, and this is where BTS is. This is where tarot cards are. And so let's talk about that. Jung's definition of the irrational is considerably longer than the rational, ironically. So, irrational. I use this term not as denoting something contrary to reason, but something beyond reason. Something, therefore, not grounded on reason. Elementary facts come into this category. The fact, for example, that the Earth has a moon, that chlorine is an element, that water reaches its greatest density at 4 degrees centigrade, etc. Another irrational fact is chance. Even though it may be possible to demonstrate a rational causation after the event. Okay, and he gives a footnote to his essay on synchronicity. Paragraph 775. The irrational is an existential factor which, though it may be pushed further and further out of sight by an increasingly elaborate rational explanation, finally makes the explanation so complicated that it passes our powers of comprehension, the limits of rational thought, being reached long before the whole of the world could be encompassed by the laws of reason. A completely rational explanation of an object that actually exists, not one that is merely posited, is a utopian ideal. Only an object that is posited can be completely explained on rational grounds, since it does not contain anything beyond what has been posited by rational thinking. Empirical science, too, posits objects that are confined within rational bounds, because by deliberately excluding the accidental, it does not consider the actual object as a whole, but only that part of it which has been singled out for rational observation. Okay, so this is Dr. Jung's comment on the scientific method. If you solve only for X and exclude everything that's irrational, okay, you get a little bit along the way of rational, but you've just excluded all the irrational things, and so you tie yourself up. What is happening to my OBS here? Okay, I guess it's all right. So when you're doing the scientific method, you're excluding the irrational, and so you're building things up, but you're making them very concrete, and you're not leaving room for the irrational or other things that may be happening in the world. For example, K-pop was built up as a rational thing, but it didn't have room within it for Kim Nam-joon and his ideas about rap and about how the music genre that he wanted to do could be different from what was there before. Okay, so that was irrational. And so now we have BTS. And so what can happen now? Okay, so now we can copy things, right? So BTS is coming out and it's basing its album on based on Murray Stein's book, Jung's Map of the Soul and Introduction. And so now any band in the world can pick up a book, any book, and make an album on it. And so I've already talked about that in a previous video, that there's a couple of Jungian books that would be great to have albums, either by BTS or by any other band. For example, Gods in Every Man and Goddesses in Every Woman by Jean Shinoda Bolen. In both of those books, she talks about 8 psychological functions. Some of them apply to men and some apply to women, but each one of those books could be the basis of an album by a musician. Another book like that is Women Who Run with the Wolves. Plus, there are many books by Jung himself that could be. And so what RM has done is he's taken the irrational and he's brought it into his world, and he's going to drop an album next Friday based on Murray Stein's book, but he's also created a new genre. And so Rudyard Kipling, the famous poet of the 19th century Britain, wrote a poem one time. It's a long poem about a industrialist who is dying, and so he's giving his advice to his son. And there's one verse in that poem that really sums up this situation. And so this is something that Kim Nam-joon could easily say. Okay, here's the quote. I've always remembered it since I read it the first time. They copied all they could follow, but they couldn't copy my mind. I left them sweating and stealing a year and a half behind. And so that's what's going to happen. So BTS's album is going to go out to the world next Friday. It's going to be a smash hit. And when it comes out, then lots of other musicians are going to get the idea of what RM has done. And I should say Kim Nam-joon has done. But they can't copy what's in his mind. So he's going to go on to the next thing, and they're going to be sweating and stealing behind him. And so the next BTS album will also be phenomenal for that reason. But anyway, okay. So reading on Irrational, paragraph 776. In this sense, thinking is a directed function, and so is feeling. When these functions are concerned not with rational choice of objects or with the qualities and interrelations of objects, but with the perception of accidentals which the actual object never lacks, they at once lose the attribute of directedness and, with it, something of their rational character, because they then accept the accidental. They begin to be irrational. The kind of thinking or feeling that is directed to the perception of accidentals and is therefore irrational is either intuitive or sensational. Both intuition and sensation are functions that find fulfillment in the absolute perception of the flux of events. Hence, by their very nature, they will react to every possible occurrence and be attuned to the absolutely contingent, and must therefore lack all rational direction. For this reason, I call them irrational functions, as opposed to thinking and feeling, which find fulfillment only when they are in complete harmony with the laws of reason. And so in terms of this irrational, let me just take the tarot cards, okay? And I make a boast about reading tarot, and that I could go into an auditorium with 1,000 people in it, and I could take the cards and simply fling them across the stage, and then just walk around the cards without any specific layout and simply read them. And what would happen is that every single person in the room, all 1,000 people, would think I had done that reading for them. Why? Because the major arcana refer to the archetypal patterns of everybody's life. And so if I read the Empress card as mother, for example, everybody's got a mother. And so when they hear that word, mother, it links to them. And so it may or may not be important to them at that one moment, but as I'm reading, some of the things that I say will hook on everybody's unconscious, some part of it. So of the 1,000 people in the room, every single person will hear a different reading, but everyone will think I did that reading for them. And so that's the way irrational works. I trust, because I've been reading the tarot for 25 years, so I trust that when I do a reading for someone, it's definitely going to connect with them. Now, they may not, they may say, oh no, and a very rational person would say, oh no, that's just baloney, that's magic and stuff, and I don't believe in that. But if they give me the benefit of the doubt, there's no doubt that they will be moved. And if they're like that, oh no, I'm not going to listen to that, well, those are people that are living a very limited life, because they're living a strictly rational life, and I'm not going to let anything out of my little circle of rationality. And what Dr. Jung is saying in this definition is that the irrational surrounds rationality, and it's the artists who pull things through from the irrational and make them rational. And so, okay, one more paragraph here. So, paragraph 777. Although the irrational as such can never become the object of science, it can never become the object of science, it is of the greatest importance for a practical psychology that the irrational factor should be correctly appraised. Practical psychology stirs up many problems that are not susceptible to a rational solution, but can only be settled irrationally, in a way not in accord with the laws of reason. The expectation or exclusive conviction that there must be a rational way of settling every conflict can be an insurmountable obstacle to finding a solution of an irrational nature. Now, this is a reference to Dr. Jung's idea of, let's see, I hope you're still hearing me. I'm getting a message that's saying my stream is not coming across, so I'm going to keep talking in the hope of having it in my recording, and I hope you continue to hear me. So in Dr. Jung's discussions, he's always talking about the opposites and how to resolve the opposites, which is duality in Buddhism, for example. And so there are always opposites. There are opposites between blue states and red states in the United States. There's an opposite between the Republic of Korea and North Korea right now. And rationality has not allowed the Korean War to end. Officially, the Korean War is still happening, and there's only been an armistice, not a treaty that solved the war. And so that's a duality that hasn't been able to be solved by rational means up till now. And so the solution to any duality, thesis and antithesis, is a synthesis. And when you have that synthesis, that opens a new dimension, something unexpected. And so you could think of it for BTS as in terms of there was a thesis of the K-pop industry, and then there's an antithesis in the form of BTS, and now that's synthesized so that BTS can be referred to as a K-pop group, but they're somewhat different from most other K-pop groups, as many BTS Army people have reflected to me. And so in all of life, there's this idea of the axiom of Maria that actually came from a woman philosopher in the 3rd century. And Maria said, 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 3, and out of the 3rd comes the 4th, which is 1 again. And so in a thesis, antithesis, synthesis, the synthesis is 1 again, and then discernment, logic, logos, will split off something out of that synthesis, and then it becomes two again. And so the whole idea is thesis, antithesis, synthesis. That opens a new dimension, rinse and repeat. Okay, and so whenever you have a synthesis, immediately that becomes a one again, and immediately it will create another opposite, unfortunately. But that's the way our psychic energy works, where our psychic energy works between the two opposites. Okay, so I've been reading that, and I've been doing a lot of talking. I want to go back and look at your chats. I will do my best to respond to whatever you've been saying, and there's a lot of things here, so I will watch for super chats, and if you decide you're willing to buy me a cup of coffee, I will certainly focus on your chat first, but if not, then I will do my best to talk about as many things as possible within the next hour. And so as I read earlier, Nia said, to be honest, Peterson gives birth to men who honestly believe social justice warriors and snowflakes, who are mostly just human rights activists, are the problem of society. No, the problem of society is living in duality. And so there has to be a synthesis between the social justice people and the rigid young, especially men, who want to live in this very logical, very rational world, because they're excluding from themselves everything that's beautiful, for example. Okay, Sean says, reminds me of Einstein didn't like the prospect of quantum mechanics. Okay, I'm not familiar enough with his views on that to respond. Gray says, yeah, that is a good point, but only if that individual takes that idea as a complete whole. The listener is responsible for their own interpretation. Absolutely. Gray says, is kind of a left brain, right brain interpretation scheme problem. Yes, absolutely. But we can come to this new level of consciousness, knowing that there's a left brain and a right brain, knowing that psychic energy runs between them, knowing that it sets up opposites, knowing that it sets up a thesis, antithesis, and knowing that the answer comes in a synthesis. Now, what Dr. Jung explained about dreams, and this is very important, and visions, is that the psyche solves these opposites. And the way it does is, we don't know how it does it, but what we know is it will present a symbol. And that symbol represents the solution. And those solutions come up in dreams. And so if we reflect on the symbol, then we will start to see what the solution is. That is entirely irrational from a consciousness point of view, but our psyche has the power to do that, and it's doing that all the time. Now, there's a difference between a sign and a symbol. A sign simply means what it means. So if you see a stop sign, it means stop your car here and look both ways before you proceed. And that's all it means, okay? A symbol, for example, the cross on a Christian church or the crescent moon on a Muslim country's flag, that represents everything that has happened up until today in Christianity or Islam. That's what those symbols represent. And so your psyche only knows how to talk to you in images. And so it presents you with a symbolic image of the solution of this opposite. And so in neurosis is always about a conflict of duties, of, I want to do this, but rationality says I have to do this, and there's a solution to that. And the solution is presented to you from the psyche. That's the point. Okay, Chris says they're not human rights activists. They're not human rights activists. They're authoritarian leftists who've been fed bad philosophy. Well, Chris, actually, there's authoritarianism on both ends of the spectrum, and we saw the results of allowing authoritarianism to run amok, both left and right, in the 20th century. The result was 175 million people were murdered because human beings couldn't raise to the next level of consciousness. And so what we need to do is not have an answer that's totally red or totally blue. It has to be purple, and that's why I'm wearing a purple shirt today. Sean says, if the collective shadow is perpetuated by shame, and the continuation is partly from our unknowingly participation in evil. Well, shame is one of the tools that religions use to manipulate us, and manipulation of the human species can certainly result in evil, not always, but sometimes. And so obviously, when you're growing up as a young person, you have to learn rules, because fundamentally you have to function in society. You have to be able to read and write. You have to do this or that. And all of us have to do that. BTS had to do that. You and I have to do that. And so there's no shame in that. And so sometimes, the Catholic Church loves to teach people with shame, for example. But if it goes too far, then it's evil, okay? And then it can be evil. And certainly, historically, we have many examples of popes who themselves were quite evil. And let's see, I'm going to go to this super chat from Gray. Thank you, Gray. I appreciate that. Can you apply this to Salome and Elijah in Mysterium and Counter, dealing with the rational and the irrational? Yes, I can. Instinct is blind, okay? And so what Gray is referring to here is the Mysterium and Counter, which occurs in the Red Book. Now, the Red Book was a visioning period that Dr. Jung recorded about 100 years ago. And during his visioning period, he had two figures approach him. One was Elijah, who was a prophet of the Old Testament, and one was Salome, who was a figure in the Old Testament who danced for Herod, I believe, and asked Herod for the head of John the Baptist. And so Dr. Jung was very surprised to find Elijah and Salome together in his vision. And Elijah at the time, at the Old Testament time, represented the rational law. Salome represented irrationality, instinct. And in the vision, in Dr. Jung's vision, Salome is blind because instinct is blind. When you're hungry, for example, your body doesn't care what you eat. It says, feed me something. And so that's your hunger is blind and irrational. It just says, feed me. Okay. But the law and your own rationality that you've built up in life, that could be seen as kind of Elijah. And so you know that you happen to like Italian food. And so that would be a rule, and that would be rational, and therefore you're going to go to an Italian restaurant to solve your irrational instinct. That, I think that is how that might apply. So in Mysterium Encounter, and I did several videos on Mysterium Encounter, which you can find on the homepage of this YouTube channel, where I actually read Dr. Jung's Mysterium Encounter into the channel so that you can listen to it at least. But if you want to read it, it's in the Red Book. So there, those two figures are psychogenic figures which appear in Jung's unconscious, and he's visioning them during his visioning period, and he's communicating with them, and he's trying to understand what they represent. And at first, you can see in his discussion that he's very confused by the presence of Salome. He doesn't understand what is this dark woman who's dressed in red and she's blind. What is her place with Elijah? And Elijah is the rational side. Salome is the irrational side. So I hope that covers your question, Ray. That's a very good question, though. So if the collective shadow is perpetuated by we did that one. Okay. How do you ever know if we're not being flung around just as much as our counterparts? Well, actually you don't know. I mean, we don't know. Meteor could appear in the sky and come and destroy us all tomorrow. And so nature is rational. And so what we have to do is we have to make our best guess. And so rationality has built up culture, which is each of our best guesses about how to face irrationality. But there's still plenty of irrational things in the world, including in our own minds. And so we have to learn as we get older and as we learn how to be human beings, we have to learn what's irrational and what's rational. And Grace says transparency. And Chris Peck says John Haidt, Steve Pinker, Christina Hoff, Summers, and many other academics have identified the same problem. Great. Glad they did it. I didn't read their stuff, and so I didn't know that, but that's great that they did. We need to get that more out into the public. Sean says, well, what if the moral consequences have opposite reactions on a different minute of interpretation? Well, they may very well, because we live in a world of opposites. That's how our psyche functions. We don't have psychic energy if we don't have opposites. So things change. And when they do, something new comes. And that's the amazing thing about BTS, because you never know what's going to happen. And I was breaking my head on how to educate young people about psychology. And all of a sudden, there are 80 million BTS fans around the world that are about to learn something about Jungian psychology. Amazing. That is terrific. And by the way, let's see if I can get it for you. There is a great discussion, 10-minute discussion by a young Korean man. And I believe his name is Danny Kim. And he gives a discussion in English, which is super. And I think I put it, it should be at the bottom of your chat now. It disappeared from my screen because I'm looking earlier in the chat. But if you take a look at that video, that's a great 10,000 foot overview of Jungian psychology. And it's also a great initial introduction to Kim Nam-joon's first song in the new album that's about to come out, Map of the Soul Persona. And you can see the monumental imagery that RM has put into that particular song, and I expect the others will be equally impressive. And so it's very exciting to see what he's done. But that 10-minute video is really worth seeing because it gives you an overview. And this young Korean man, whose name I believe is Danny Kim, has done a terrific job of describing it with great energy. And so I suggest that you go take a look at that. But just because you understand what Danny Kim says, don't think that you understand Jungian psychology, because Jungian psychology is a circumambulating of the middle, and it's a spiral downward. You get deeper and deeper and deeper into your unconscious. So what Danny Kim has given you is the very surface layer, the very rational surface layer of Jungian psychology. But if you want to understand your dreams, if you want to understand religion, if you want to understand how to use Jungian psychology to create art of all kinds, whether it's writing or painting or composing music or dancing, whatever your art is, it could be making dinner. Whatever your art is informed by Jungian psychology, and you have to get deeper and deeper and deeper into it. So what Danny has given you is the very high level surface layer, the 10,000-foot layer, and then you get into Jungian psychology and you start to read. And, you know, even Kim Nam-joon's foray into this, he's understood a lot. He's done very well. But he's basing his album on a book that Murray Stein, who's a famous Jungian analyst, wrote for laymen. It's not a book that was written for true Jungians. And so even that book is only offering a superficial layer. And until you get into Dr. Jung's actual writing, you're never going to really grok it. And as I said, I've been looking at this for 32 years, and it's only this morning that I got the fact that irrational and rational are not opposites. Okay, they're not opposites in the rational versus irrational. They are rational as a circle and irrational all around it. And gradually artists are able to bring into the rational things that are in the irrational that raise our level of consciousness. And so that's what I hope I'm doing, because doing this video is my form of art. Okay, it's my form of creativity. So I'm trying to give you a new perspective on how to think about rational and irrational. So Jordan Peterson wanted to give you the rules of life. I want to give you the whole ball of wax, the rules with the irrational around it, and the fact that that has to be synthesized. And when we can synthesize, when we can take any duality in life and find the synthesis of that duality, we're going to start to get to a new level of consciousness. And that's what Dr. Jung was hoping for in his lifetime. And so Sean was referring to the observer effect, and yes, it depends on who you are, you know, where you start where you are, and you make an experiment and you correct, and then you go on. And so Chris had asked if I had read Peterson. I said yes. Sean says, the altering of a good view becomes bad because of the tide of the collective. Yep, that's right. And so the point of RM at the very end of this song is he's there and there's a collective of robots behind him, because the collective tends to create robots. And he snaps his fingers and all the robots collapse, because the collective collapses when an individual raises to the next level of consciousness. Then all the robots have to start getting up higher into knowledge. Gray says, we see time as a driver. Let's see. Gray says, it's difficult at that point for sure. Gebser spoke of this in ever-present origin, and he would say it is grounded in a misunderstanding of time. We see time as a driving force. It seems more to be an intensity. Yep, okay. I don't want to get into all the points that are around that, Gray, at this point. But Gray is talking about certain things that are very deep in Dr. Jung's work. And Sean says, I guess that is the problem an atheist would have to face if we have no rules. I don't know. I'm not quite following that idea. Gray says, so we then can see through the incorrect position of the observer. Well, certainly we have to integrate the incorrect position somehow, and then from the synthesis we create a new position. And Nia says, white lies smooth the relationships, and I agree with that. So you just have to be careful. Chris Peck says, so then you're offering rules then. Yep, and new rules would be a little white lie sometimes smooths a relationship. I'm sure you've experienced that yourself, Chris, and that's a rule, but we have to learn how to break that rule then, and go back to the idea of telling no lies, because there's nothing particularly wrong with Jordan Peterson's rules. The trouble is there's more to it than his rules. The little Gumnut says, miserable month. Wow, okay, I'm not sure what that relevance is. You can have rules, Gray says, you can have rules, you just don't hold them in perfection. BTS Army gives us a couple of smiles. Yep. Chris says, you just gave a rule for when your wife comes home after her hair. Yep, that's right, I did. So that's the rule that breaks the rule. And GLJ Angel says, anyone likes to be seen, surely. And surely your wife would like to be seen. BTS Army twit about this live. Let's all watch it. Yep. Okay, I'm glad we have 34 simultaneous viewers at this moment, and I'm very appreciative to BTS for making this teaching go much broader. And I've had a huge increase in followers and such in the last week, thanks to the BTS Army. And so you can be sure that I'm going to continue to do live streams in support of the BTS Army, because I'm convinced that this is the way, through what BTS is doing with this album, this is the way we're going to get so many young people around the world more educated about psychology, and especially about Jungian psychology, which has been repressed for 100 years by theologians and other psychologists. Chris says, which is Peterson's whole point? Try to tell the truth. It's not some authoritarian demand. Okay, as I've said many times, Chris, and you can find it on many of my videos, I agree with 99.5% of everything that Jordan Peterson says. Okay, and where I get off the bus is his total reliance on the logos and saying that anything that isn't part of the logos is chaos. It's not chaos. It's something that we haven't worked with yet, but it's not chaos. And women are not chaos, okay? The feminine is not chaos. The feminine is half the sky, or more than half the sky, because most people in the world, the larger percentage are women. So the idea that there's masculine and masculine is right and feminine is wrong, that's total crap, okay? Throw that away right now. And so what we're talking about is, all women, as well as all men, live in a culture, and we all follow rules, and we are all rational, men and women. We are rational. If you're a Muslim woman, you probably wear a hijab. Why? Because that's the rule in the Muslim world, or a rule in the Muslim world, honored more by some and less by others, but still, if you're a Muslim woman, you might wear a hijab because that's an indication that you have accepted the prevailing culture in your community, and that's following a rule. And the fact that you might not want to wear a hijab, that's not chaos. That's just that's irrational in your society. But lots of Muslim women, I've been to Saudi Arabia 23 times. I've spent more than 6 months there. And I've seen several Saudi women who are wearing an abaya, which covers them. And on the back of the abaya, sewn into it in sequins, is a picture of Mickey Mouse. And so what they're saying, what they're resisting, okay, they're resistors to this rigid rationality that says they have to cover themselves. They're saying this is a Mickey Mouse idea. Okay, this is just bull, is what they're saying when they're wearing that hijab. And so that's where I get off the bus with Jordan Peterson, where he's insisting on the logos, because there are things that have to change in the world, and they may come outside of the rationality of a given culture. Martin says, wife's hair, so INTP and very valid for a system builder, extroverted feeler in the fourth slot. Learn how other and harmony will bring best results on an intellectual level. It's all a balance. We're talking about mental health and psychological balance here, and that's what I'm trying to get at here. Gray says, I agree, Chris, plus the burden of responsibility is also on the individual, not just the rule giver. You just have to understand the opposite of a rule will also be true. And so let me emphasize that one thing I do not disagree with Jordan Peterson about, I agree with him 100%, is that learning the rules and going to education and studying Jordan Peterson are all about getting you as a human being to accept the responsibility of being a human being. Okay, when you're born, you're a wild animal. And throughout your childhood and adolescence, you're learning how to be a human being. Okay, but what's the purpose of learning how to be a human being? Ultimately, you have to step into maturity and to take a role in the world. And when you take a role in the world, by definition, that means you have to accept responsibility. And so my point is, nobody's going to come to you and say, here's the rules, sign here, and you're going to have a job and an income for the rest of your life. Nobody's going to do that. And so what you have to do is, wherever you are, whoever you are, man or woman, whatever nationality you are, you have to say, what's the best thing that I can do now? And go try to do that. It might be the right thing and it might be the wrong thing. If it's the right thing, keep going. If it's the wrong thing, then you've made a mistake. When you make a mistake, you can lament about that mistake, go have a little cry about it or be depressed about it, but then get born into the next thing, because what happens is the contest is the thesis, the mistake is the antithesis, and the lamentation is the synthesis, and that leads to the one, which is the next thesis. And it's a whole new dimension. Okay, it opens up a whole new dimension, because if you went on The Voice and you got rejected by The Voice, and now you know you're not going to be a rock star, then you have to enter a new dimension. Maybe you have to go to law school or something. Who knows? I don't know. But you have to make mistakes and then, okay, learn from those mistakes and go on. That's why I always ask people in job interviews, what's the biggest mistake you ever made? Because I want to know how seaworthy this person is and how mature they are about assuming the responsibility that I'm going to give them if I give them a job. And so anyway, I do agree with Jordan Peterson that responsibility is a key thing, and that if you're a young person, you have to understand that the reason you were born and the reason you've been educated up to the point where you can be listening to what I'm saying is that you're going to become a mature human being somewhere in the world, and that's why you exist. And so the point is that you have to assume the burden of being that human being, whatever it is. And so Julius says, Peterson is flawed, but he has his worth. He certainly has his worth. I mean, I've learned a lot from Jordan Peterson. There's no question. Before I listened to his lectures, I had never studied psychology other than Jungian psychology in my life. And so he's opened my eyes to lots of things. And I have tremendous respect for what he's been through the last 3 years, and the fact that he has such a huge following is terrific, because he has been serving an obvious need that men have been feeling, especially men in the West, for a very long time. And so I agree that he is serving an important function, and he has served that function for me as well. However, I'm saying that the way he's been saying some things isn't quite the answer. And I've been struggling with how to express my reservation for a very long time. And even this morning, I'm starting to get my voice on it thanks to BTS, because BTS has introduced to me the solution to what my reservation has been. Sean says, if somebody tells you a rule, break it. That's the only thing to move things forward, according to Hans Zimmer. Yes. Chris says, Juliana, everyone is flawed, but that's not an argument against anything he said. And Julia says, I'm not saying that. Fibug says, I'm not fluent in English speaking, but I'm trying to understand. And I'm sorry that I can only give these talks in English. However, I have made the translation function available on all of my videos. So if anyone hears something that they think is good and wants to translate it into any other language, I'm all for it. Please go ahead. I'm sorry I can't afford to pay for translation, but I understand that many members of the BTS Army will do that voluntarily, and so this only started a week ago tomorrow, and so I'm hopeful that members of the BTS Army will start to make those contributions. Sophia says, hello. Grace says, one thing to consider is Moses was given the written law, which is still the word. Christ became flesh. He lived. All I'm saying here is this: rules, laws, words always break down. Absolutely. And then we have to bring them into life and work with them. Grace says, entropy catches up. Yes. Grace says, an individual must have his responsibility out. It isn't a rule, it's a psychological, and I'll say biological necessity. Sean says, I thought of the opposite to rationality was obliviousness. Well, it could be obliviousness. You can be oblivious to other things. Obviously, authoritarians and extremely rational people live a very constrained life. Martin says, yes, cognitive functions, thinking and feeling, are rational, and our judging functions, irrational, our perception and with sensing and intuition. And Martin, actually, it's only today that that particular fact, that penny dropped with me. So I've been studying this stuff for 32 years, and I only just today got that one. And so I thank you for mentioning it again. Chris, you don't like his rule skip, especially as it applies to men. What is your solution to the crisis of boys, young men in our culture? Well, Jordan Peterson may be one of the solutions. He's not the solution. And we need to go beyond what Jordan Peterson has said, because he's all about logos and rationality. And yes, young men need that. And, you know, as I said, in the Marines, I always had young men who were saying to me, give me the rules, tell me what the mission is, and I'll go do it. And then, but the problem is you follow all the rules all your life, and then you find out that somehow the rule is broken at a higher level than you expected. And then you've got a problem. And so we haven't developed seaworthy boys and girls until we understand how rationality and irrationality work together in life. And that's a psychological activity that goes with this new level of consciousness that Dr. Jung was trying to drive out through all of his writing. And so, you know, it's not that I don't like rules. I'm a lieutenant colonel retired in the U.S. Marine Corps, so I certainly not know how to follow a damn rule, and I know how to make people follow rules. So it's not that I don't like rules, it's that we have to have both. And so the Marine Corps has a specific function. Okay, the Marine Corps is a weapon that belongs to the President of the United States. And so within the U.S. Marine Corps, there's no exception, in the same sense that in the production plant for the iPhone, there's no exception. You have to build an iPhone exactly right, 100%, okay? But that doesn't mean that there isn't irrationality out in the world, and that somehow, somewhere out there in the world is going to have an insight that's going to change the way smartphones work a decade from now. And it doesn't say that in the Marine Corps, it doesn't say that there's not somebody out there in the world that's going to change the perception of humanity, and suddenly we won't need that weapon anymore. Boy, that would be greatly hoped for by me and every U.S. Marine. But because, nobody wants to go to war, but some people have to know how to do it. And that's my perspective. And so as long as we need people who know how to do it, then we should have a U.S. Marine Corps. And it should be 100% perfect U.S. Marine Corps. Just like an iPhone has to be 100% perfect iPhone. And that is full of rules, but we don't advance, we don't increase the level of consciousness of our species unless we go beyond rules. That's my point. Sean says, I don't believe he is discrediting his work, but rather saying that there's something missing. Yes, that's my point. Nia says, I consider the irrational part of the puzzle. I need to see all pieces so I know I didn't miss details. Often they can change the big picture, however. But the reality is, Nia, that you're never going to have all the pieces, okay? I mean, you can have more and more pieces, but there are always pieces that are missing. So ultimately, you have to get the best synthesis you can and move on. Chris says, he seems to be suggesting that Peterson is leading young men, although many women are interested in Peterson as well, astray by giving them rules. I am not saying that, and please don't put ideas in my mouth. I am simply saying that there is rationality and there is the irrational, and they both have a place in psychic balance and in society. Nia says, let it go, just live and be yourself. Don't seek rules, seek yourself. What to wear, want to wear a dress, wear it. Want to become a bodybuilder, become one, but because you want it, not because someone said so. Somebody said so. Right. We all have to learn how to become ourselves. There's an amusing little anecdote that I read in the Jungian circle somewhere recently where, I heard it from a friend who's a great Jungian, and he said that Rabbi Zosia said that when he goes to heaven, God is not going to ask him why he wasn't more like Abraham. God is going to ask him why he wasn't more like Zosia. And so the point is that yourself, your deepest archetype in your unconscious wants you to develop in some way. You have to learn how to hear what yourself is saying and develop in that way. And only then are you going to be able to face St. Peter and be what God intended you to be. Let's put it that way. That's a good way to put it. Grace says, sorry, I agree. I would also say Peterson never says the rules are laws, but ultimately rules will always decay. Right. And yeah, there's no doubt about that. Nia says that's how men can liberate themselves from toxic culture. Yes. Chris, Nia, are those rules? Be yourself sounds like a rule. Okay, yeah, it sounds like a rule. And so that's thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and then there's a new rule. And then there's an antithesis to that as well. So as long as you're in that cycle, you're in the opposites, and you have to always be looking for a synthesis. Gray says, and from the animal within Neo, which for me was more toxic than the culture. And CC Cover says, I love how you are talking about the album almost every day, and I'm going to continue to try to do that because I think that BTS has opened up something very important for our species, and I'm going to continue to try to be supportive to the BTS Army. Nia says, no, being yourself is you being born and living. If you want to follow rules, you can, but do it so it reveals yourself to yourself. Good point. Very well put, Nia. I appreciate that. And Gray says transparency. CC says, this is so calming. I love your voice. Thank you very much. Martin says, some people will rebel to rules in general based on their personality and values of non-restriction or freedom, but their life is manifest as no structure. Can't get it together. Well, every human being has to live by certain rules, and it just is in the function of the being. And so, the question isn't whether to break rules, it's which rules to break and when, under what circumstances. Martin says relationships, work, house, tidy, etc. Yes. Okay. Sean says, it is those moments of clarity that we get every once in a while that we can break and change a pattern in ourselves. Yes, Sean, I agree. And that's what even happened to me this morning, because I was always thinking of rational versus irrational as opposites. But it's really not that at all. It's really rational, in which we create our culture, and irrational on all sides of it. Think of another encircling circle. And it's from the irrational that we can advance as human beings, not from all the rules. Nia says, BTS is a good example of Eastern and Western culture coming together. They're very much Korean people, but they have grown up with Western ideals too. Took the best of both to improve as people and as artists. I agree entirely. I'm extremely impressed by what I've seen so far. Grace says the actual goal is diversity. Actually, the actual goal is wholeness, whether it's wholeness within yourself, wholeness within your group, wholeness within your nation, or wholeness within humanity at large. And so I'd like to see wholeness within humanity at large, and BTS is pointing the way to that, and I think that's very exciting. Sean says Jordan believes in power hierarchy as a solution to fix chaos. I guess a sort of assimilation of synchronicity would be the opposite. Well, I think they're somewhat different. I do agree that Jordan emphasizes power hierarchy a lot, and perhaps more than he should. I think that what we're looking for is assimilation, so that we all understand one another as human beings around the world. And that sometimes does happen by synchronicity, and we've talked about this in other sessions, and we'll continue to talk about it, but I am not going to address it too much here. Info says, Sean Steele, he believes in competence, not power. Okay, yeah, I think that that's true. I think any university professor wants to create competent students who will look back at him and say, wow, so much I learned from this person when I was in university. Sean Shore as a differentiation from the ego. Nia, competence is not a good way to sort people, though, at least not in today's reality. Right, because we need competent people in all walks of life and in everything. So it's not a question of sorting people. It's a question of how it all works together. Sean, though when he is talking about thick chaos in his biblical series, I do believe he says power. Probably because the Old Testament times were about the law and about bringing human beings to a new level of consciousness, because before that we were operating by instinct hugely. And then Moses brought the Ten Commandments down from the mountain, and that allowed at least Western human thought to start to be channelized into the law, and that allowed the development of civilization instead of a bunch of warring tribes running around the place. And so, there was thick chaos at that time, and human consciousness accepted the law, and then belief, when Christ came along and introduced the idea of belief, that allowed Western civilization to develop quite a bit more. And now we're going into a new phase, because the myths of Christianity have had holes punched in them. Have had holes punched in them for 500 years now, since the time of Galileo and Copernicus. And so now we need a new way of thinking about it, and that's the new level of consciousness that we're approaching, which is to understand that we have to understand ourselves and our own psychology, and that's what BTS is pointing to now, and that's a new level of competence for everyone. Competence can easily be manipulated either way. It depends on the status quo. That's true. Now, I will come back, but I'm going to excuse myself for a moment because I have an instinctual need, and I will be back in 1 minute. Okay, so that's a Buddhist-style lesson, which is we're all animals at base, and we have to recognize that we are animals and we have instincts. And I honored culture by turning off the microphone so you wouldn't be hearing the toilet flush, but here I am back. Now I'm good for a bit longer. And Sean was talking about the collective shadow. I'm not going to get into the collective shadow today. BTS Army, I know it's out of the context, but can I ask you about two-sided of Dionysus? BTS Army, I'm sorry, but I don't know what's ahead in the chat right now. And I don't know really what you're referring to. Let me Exactly, because there's a lot written on this, especially in Jungian circles. So let me give you my email address. Please write your question to me by email. I will review the question and try to do a session on it in future sessions, because this is an important area of Jungian psychology, but we're so far into this now, and the chat is going so fast that I need to not get into great detail at this point. Info says, why would competence be a bad way to sort people? I think the message is more sort yourself out before sorting others out beforehand. Yeah, I mean, that certainly makes sense. I mean, sorting out, I take to mean when you're born, there's chaos going on. If you look at a little baby and watch its reactions to its environment, it literally is in chaos, and it has so much going on inside its psyche and outside its psyche, and it's very actively trying to sort that out. And so, and we're constantly trying to support or sort out how to live in the world so that everybody can make a decent living, everyone can be fed, and everyone can be happy. That those are efforts that are constantly going on in the human species. And so that's a constant process, sorting, figuring out who we are. And obviously competence is significant in that, in the sense that, okay, I have a certain competence in Jungian psychology. I'm not a trained Jungian analyst. I'm not a mental health professional, so I do not have those competences. What I have is 32 years of reading Dr. Jung's work and a huge variety of life experience. I've reinvented myself many times. So as a result of those facts, I have a certain competence, and I know something about technology, since I've been using computers since 1983. Here's a fun fact. I met my wife on a computer network in 1985, and as far as I know, we're the first couple to meet online and marry. And I've made that assertion many times. I've never met anybody that met their spouse online and married them before the two of us met online and married. So I'm an early adopter in technology, and I'm a writer. I've written 4 books, and so all those things give me a certain competence and life experience, which I can share with you. To kind of steel man Jordan's argument, you do need harmony at some microcosm. If you have no harmony, music or whatever domain will just be atonal. That's an interesting point, Sean, and I wish you'd expand on that. We can have a conversation about that at some point, even an interview. And Grace says, you need magic. Just sucks that no one can teach it or explain it. That's the thing, yes, because it is irrational. Yes, it is irrational. You have to grok it. You have to just get it. Good example would be, Sean says, how hard is it to find a planet that supports human life? That's a great example. Nia says, I pretty much explained already, but again, historically, competence is dependent on many factors, much not even related to the individual's possible capabilities, surely. I could have been a doctor, let's say, but I didn't do that. I did something else instead. GLJ Angel says, overdose. Yes, surely the more light, the brighter they shine, the higher the number of evolving individuals, the greater the awareness in the world as a whole. I think I probably have introduced some ideas that are going to enter the collective unconscious very soon, thanks to BTS, and just in this conversation here. So I hope you all go out and tell your friends to listen to this playback. Sean says you need both belief and doubt, which are the building blocks of rules. Otherwise, you're just a projection of something else. I agree with that. And also, even if you know, even if you don't need to believe you know, you can't really say what you know, okay? And so one of the important things of Dr. Jung's life was his work on religion, which is about 30 years of his writing was mostly about religion, directly and indirectly. And so there's this video clip on YouTube, which you can find, where Dr. Jung is asked, and do you believe in God? And he says, well, very complicated, but I have no need to believe. I know. And he knew, and I know. And when he said that, the first time I watched it, I had an epiphany. I said, wow, I know. And so then I had to spend the next 10 years working out for myself what I know. And the point is that if you have to believe, then you don't know. And people who do know don't need religion. Although religion is very useful to bring you along to the point where you can know. So that's the paradox. It's not that religion is wrong. Any religion, they're all doing the same thing, but you need to rise to a point where you know, okay? And I can't tell you what that means. So you need to work on it until you know. And one of the traditional ways of doing that is by having a religious experience. And William James wrote a book called Varieties of Religious Experience. There's an audible version of it, which I'm currently listening to. It's quite good. So I'm not going to try to describe a religious experience in this particular video. I have done before. But once you have that experience, then you know. And Sean says, I think the answer is openness. Okay, and that's to this issue of projecting. And Grace says, otherwise you become a dumb fish. Absolutely. And Sriram Kumar says, Dear Skip, I've seen you talk a lot about how Peterson lays too much emphasis on the logos, and your critique that man also needs eros to balance and achieve a lot of conjunctio. Absolutely, because, and the point is that the logos gives you a framework to live your life in, okay? And so when you're being educated, it's all about logos. You're learning the rules. Whether you're getting to high school or you're getting to a PhD, you're learning the rules. And so that gives you a framework. But if you have a PhD in psychology, you still don't know squat about what it's going to be like to being a practicing psychologist, just like me. Okay, I studied the law, okay, and so I got sucked into going to law school, which I enjoyed very much. I very much enjoyed going to law school, but I had no clue what it was like to be practicing law. And what I can tell you is I detest the practice of law. I absolutely detest it at my deepest level. And But when I graduated from law school and got admitted to the New York bar, I had no idea about that. And so I started to practice. I practiced for 5 years. And very soon I said, wow, I don't like this very much. I'd rather be in business. So 3 years into the practice of law, I started to go to business school. And after 5 years, I got an MBA. And so I thought that time I was on my way. And I did some things that were very powerful. I got to take my wife to Japan and start a subsidiary for a Rochester, New York company. And I enjoyed being a businessman much more than I enjoyed practicing law, and have been doing it in one way or another for 40 years. But, and one of the things I relied upon in my business career was the solidity of Lehman Brothers as an investment bank. That's one of the things I relied on. They had 187 years of success, and so I was hanging my hat in my business career on that success, believing everything they told me, right up to the point where they went bankrupt. And when that happened on September 15th, 2008, I lost my life savings. And when that happened, I had to reinvent myself entirely. And so what you're seeing today is part of the results of that reinvention. So Chris says, like when the Marxists insisted that the kulaks were corrupt rather than competent farmers, how did that work out? Yeah, and the point is, I'm not sure I finished my point about left and right, but you had the communists on the right and the Nazis on the left, and they both went to their extreme, and so they're both murdering people at the extreme. And so if you want to understand that, you can hear what Dr. Peterson says about the Gulag Archipelago and about those topics, which are topics he's very competent about. And just recently, I was telling Sean about the movie and novel King Rat. And I had seen the movie, which came out in 1965. I had seen it when I was very young, under 20, and I really did not like this movie. And then when I was in business, I was going to do business in Japan, so I decided to read James Clavell's book, Shogun. And that is an awesome novel about life in general and about dealing with Japanese and so on. And it's about a British navigator who ends up on the shores of Japan, shipwrecked in 1599. And his ship had in it 500 muskets. And in the next 6 months, he was able to stay alive by teaching Shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu how to use muskets in battle. And that was important because in October of 1600, I don't have the exact dates precisely here, I think the Battle of Sekigahara was between the 7th and 10th of October, 1600, if I remember. But Japan had had a red state, blue state thing going between Osaka and Tokyo. And there were huge armies on both sides, the various daimyos. There were 264 warlords around Japan, all tribal stuff, right? But they had built up to the point where there were shoguns. And so there's a mountain range across Japan. Japan is a very mountainous country, but there's a mountain range from the coast north across Japan, and there's a pass in that mountain range at a place called Sekigahara. And in that pass, it's only about 30 meters wide. And in that, therefore, that pass was extremely important. And so that there was a battle between the armies of the North and the armies of the South, and it was the largest hand-to-hand combat battle in the history of the world. And that battle decided that basically that Tokyo would be the capital of Japan, among many other things. But Will Adams landing in Japan with the 500 muskets was the decisive factor that allowed Tokugawa Ieyasu to win, because Ieyasu was smart enough to learn the new technology, and therefore he won the battle. So I was very interested in that fact as I was preparing to do business in Japan in the early 1980s. I had gone to high school in Japan in the early 1960s, and then I went away for 16 years, and when I went back, I ran a business there for 5 years. Read this book, and I really liked James Covell, so then I said, then I realized that he had written King Rat, and so I went back and I read this book, and reading the novel, I really loved it. I hated the movie, but I really loved the novel, and the reason I did was because it's basically Economics 101. Okay, it's about how prisoners in Changi prison in Singapore during World War II created an entire economy around raising rats, okay, believe it or not. And and so if you read that book, you can learn a lot about economics. But if you go look at the movie, it almost didn't touch the economic aspect of this novel. And what the movie is really about is man's inhumanity to man. It's about brutality and the brutality of life, very much like you see in the Gulag Archipelago. And it's about how horrible human beings can be in very tough situation. And so all those things are useful, but I urge you to go back and read King Rat, and then I urge you to, on demand or on Netflix, go watch King Rat on the movie, and you'll see what Jordan Peterson is talking about when he's talking about the Gulag Archipelago. So moving on. So we need a balance, and Buddhism talks about the middle way, and we're talking about psychic balance here and how to find your way in life, and that's a psychological function that we need to have in this next level of human consciousness, and that is what BTS is doing. They are showing you how to have balance. And so info says, which rules of Jung's contradict Peterson's? I read Dr. Jung's Rules of Life at the beginning of this video, which apparently you weren't here for. So I do hope that you'll go back and listen to that part of this video. But let me just read the key sentence here. Dr. Jung says, I would like to remark that I have had so much to do with people that I have always endeavored to live by no rules as far as possible. Non-observance of rules requires, of course, far less effort, for usually one makes a rule in order to repress the tendency in oneself not to follow it. So, that sort of answers your question, info, but if you want to hear the whole essay, please go back to that. Is a love weirdo. Hello, I'm happy and finally catch you live. Sriram Peterson always talks about meaning being the line between chaos and order, which is similar to the balance Jung speaks of. Yeah, and Jung talks extensively about meaning and the fact that you have to get a meaning. And, the whole point is that if you're sitting around your mother's house and eating your mother and father's food and you're not going very far, then you're a nihilist. And the point is, you have to get a life. You have to go out and try something, do something, make a few mistakes, and that will guide you on. And that's how you get meaning. And I can't tell you what your meaning should be. I can only tell you that as long as you're useless because you've been a child and an adolescent all the way up, and you haven't gone out and gotten a life, then you're going to be nihilist. And if you're not going to be in your life, and that's the key. So, Shriram says, and Peterson himself critiques rationality and intelligence, comparing it to how Lucifer turned into Satan out of vanity. Yeah, okay. I mean, the point is that rationality gets you concreteness, and concreteness gives you a very restricted life that you can't do anything in. And so you need to have some irrationality in your life. Jerome says, in my humble opinion, the key words are using functions that find fulfillment. While we find fulfillment in using our preferred function, we should also strive to use functions appropriate to the situation. Absolutely. And thank you, Jerome. Jerome is a very knowledgeable person on the Myers-Briggs type indicator. And so if you ever see him on any of our chats, he's a good person to ask questions and to be in contact with. Info says exactly my point when you say competence is really power, and that a society cannot work by that idea. You have a Marxist society. I'm not, without having an interview with you, Info, I'm not sure what you're saying here. I think you're trying to throw some political stuff in here, which, we can have an interview about it, but I'm not going to address that. Sri Rami does warn people about playing rationality, intelligence, and the only true value and its perils. Okay. Grades, yes, the danger of the intellect, Sri Ram. And there are also videos where he talks about art and chaos and its importance in individual life and society. Okay, terrific. I probably didn't hear those. Great. Peterson also defines evil as a force acting as if their knowledge is complete. Okay, that can be a source of it. Sri Ram, what I feel is that there is in general a lack of logos related voices, messages in Western culture right now. No, we have way too many logos voices in society right now. We need to start breaking that down a little bit. Sri Ram, and for that reason mainly his messages of responsibility are repeated more. Okay, well he's amplifying the uses and abuses of logos. Certainly he's doing that, but that's not the only answer in life. And as Leonardo da Vinci said, he who has access to the fountain does not go to the water jar. So the logos is the water jar. That's your education that you got through life, however long you went. But that's not life. That's just a structure. And the fountain is life. And so Shuram says, and for that reason mainly, his messages of responsibility are repeated more. Well, you do have to take responsibility in life. That's what being a mature human being means, Gray says, which would point to him not taking the rules as ultimate ideas. Yeah, I agree with that. And the problem is that the way they are presented as rules, especially young men who look for rules as the way to get through life, tend in itself to be too concrete. And so it works fine in the Marine Corps where you want a weapon and where you want everybody to follow the rules explicitly. It works fine on the shop floor building an iPhone or an automobile or an airplane where it has to be 100% perfect. Rules have a place in our life. Logos has a place in our life. We don't want anybody working on the assembly line of any airplane that doesn't follow the precise rules of building that airplane. Definitely. Okay, but an airplane is just a vehicle that gets you from place to place. The life is the people that are in that airplane. So, yeah, Shuram says, yes, I think he only presents his rules are his opinion, guidelines, lessons to be learned. Okay, fair enough. But unfortunately, young men tend to start to get the idea that wow, if I learn these rules, then I'm done and I don't have to worry. And life doesn't work that way. And Sean says openness plus feelings versus neuroticism plus thinking. Okay, I'm going to leave that comment just stand. Because it would be too complicated to respond. And Skip, as a young adult who's grown up in a culture of softness and lost meaning, Peterson's message did help and resonate with me. Well, it resonates with lots of people if you listen to his talks, and including it resonates with me. And your point is very well taken, since I happen to know something about India, but only when one looks into his lesser watched works we get to see the sides where he talks about Eros. Okay, fair enough. And obviously there's a place for everything, including this video. I'm not giving you any rules. I'm trying to give you things to think about based on my personal experience. I'm trying to help the BTS Army understand this, okay? And so one of the things that what BTS would like today is there's a hashtag. I'm going to put it out here again. It's hashtag map of the soul persona, and BTS is trying to get 27 million tweets or retweets that have that hashtag in it. I hope I spelled it right today. It's persona with one N. And so if you have a Twitter account and you want to help BTS as a member of the BTS Army, today is the day. Please use that hashtag as often as possible today. And what that will do maybe is help this album have a big launch. And that's obviously happening no matter what we do. Info says, I don't think you meant to take the rules as ultimate ideas. You use them as tools. Okay, fair enough. That's your perception, and I hope a lot of people have that perception. But unfortunately, a lot of young men do take rules very literally. Sriram, and the metaphor that you told about the artist taking things out of the irrational is something that Peterson himself has said. Right, okay. Jordan Peterson is very smart. psychology professor, so I would expect that in Sriram, but using the term chaos to represent the irrational, that I object to. Okay, because, and I object to some of these dualities, because when you start to make two buckets, one masculine and one feminine, and then you talk about rational versus chaos, or rules versus chaos, then you're saying that women are chaotic, and that's not the case at all. Okay, women are very rational, and they know how to build a life and to build wholeness, and they know that instinctually. And so we have to stop talking about these opposite buckets as masculine and feminine, because then we're just trying to keep women down. And, you know, what you can see very clearly is that countries that hold their women back don't advance as fast. I mean, it's like writing off half of your brain power in a country. And, you know, you can see that very clearly in a place like Saudi Arabia, where women aren't even visible, basically, and or very little. And the feminine principle is really written out of the Saudi environment. And the country doesn't have much going for itself except oil. And so if you took the oil away from Saudi Arabia, you wouldn't have much of a country at all. And, you know, it's changing and it's modernizing. So in the healthcare industry, it's very advanced, for example. And there are women working in the healthcare industry in Saudi, but only until about a decade ago, there were very few Saudi nurses, for example, and they were having to import, and I think they're still having to import nurses from India and the Philippines and many other places, because they don't train nurses, or they didn't. They do have some nursing schools now, but that's only a phenomenon in the last decade. And so it's going to take a long time to change that. And all right, so let's see what else here. All right, so Sriram says you can search on YouTube for Catholic student asks Dr. Jordan Peterson about contradiction in the Bible to see the video where he talks about the comparison of Lucifer and rationality. Fine, great pointer. Joseph says mandorla. Okay, so in a mandorla is where two circles, two mandalas meet, and they overcross, and in the middle, and the mandorla is the whole image, but the space in the middle is where there's agreement. Okay, and that is a very important idea, because in business, when you're making a contract, one side wants one thing and one side wants another thing, and it's where the two sides watch each other. In that space, you can have trade. And that's a very important idea, the mandorla. Miles says, I hear you. And Cecilia says, whoops, I lost that. Miles, I'm sorry. Okay. I am very sorry, but I have lost my place on this exchange. And this is getting to be a very long video, so I'm going to discontinue for today. I'm very grateful to the people that have been with me, especially throughout the entire now 2.5 hours. And I will do my best to be online again tomorrow at 10 a.m. and we'll have another discussion. I'm sorry I haven't gotten to all the chat points. I will try to take a look at those and over the next few hours and see if there's something that needs further discussion, if possible. And obviously, in future live streams, if you are especially anxious to hear me comment about something, I would very much appreciate a super chat. I will do my very best to respond immediately to all super chats, at least when I'm not reading. And otherwise, I can't guarantee that I can respond, but I will do my best. And so I thank you, Gray, for super chatting me today. That is very much appreciated. And so I'm going to terminate for today and get your order in for Map of the Soul Persona by BTS. Amazon has some interesting ways you can buy it. When I tried to buy just one copy, I got a response saying there are now 4 versions of the first album, and you can have one version for $21, but we won't commit to which version it's going to be. But if you want all 4 versions, you can pay $87. So I did that, and with the idea that sometime in the future, there will be young people who want to buy that as a collector's item. And meanwhile, I will use my single copy to actually listen to the music and to make some more thoughts about it. So I think this is a marvelous thing that BTS is doing, and I'm very much looking forward to the tsunami that we're going to experience in Jungian psychology over the next days and months. So just remember, today is the day that they're trying to break this record. So I'm going to put this hashtag in one more time. And I do have it right this time. So use that hashtag on Twitter. That will help BTS and the BTS Army. And thank you for viewing. I realized a week ago that this was going to be a tsunami, and so I have made a number of other live stream videos already. They are already on playback, and you can go back and listen to them. I'm trying to introduce key ideas in Jungian psychology that you can then use for yourself, and that's my main objective here. And